just wait. Okay. Okay,
There we
now
go.
recording now.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I didn't want you
Sorry.
to miss all the exciting
Yeah,
information.
that's true. Thank
Welcome to Zoom in the new era. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So once again, thank you for having me. My name is Rojas, and I work for a community college district in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix is located in the southwest part of the United States. We are a large urban community college. We're a 2-year institution. However, we just recently, our legislation just voted to allow the community colleges in Arizona to offer 4-year degrees. But for now, we're going to focus on Maricopa Community Colleges being a sending institution to the universities. So to give you a little context of how big we are, we service almost close to 100,000 students year round. The number of transfer partners we have to date is about 55 partners. That's a lot of partners. Most institutions really work with their feeder university and may have 1 or 2 colleges and universities that they work with. But being a large community college district, a lot of universities in our geographical region really want to work with us because they know that there's tremendous mobility. Students are coming within the state, they're leaving the state. And so we want to make sure that wherever they're coming and wherever they're going, that we're working with the top feeder institutions based off of enrollment to support their transition so that they could obtain their educational goals once they leave our state. We primarily work with our 3 public universities. You may have heard of them: Arizona State University, Northern Arizona, and then also the University of Arizona. So on average, we have about 7,000 students transferring to these 3 universities annually. However, we have major universities that are moving within our state: Grand Canyon University, Southern New Hampshire, as well as Western Governors University, who are growing in popularity related to our transfer students. And so you could see how we need to figure out and organize ourselves to be able to support all of this tremendous mobility, and then also the expectations in partnering with these universities and the growing list of institutions that we're working with. And just to kind of give you a perspective, we are really passionate, and we want to make sure that as students are leaving us and they transition to the university, that they're earning credentials on their way out. That really helps the conversation as we're working with the universities to basically say, if a student earns a certificate or an associate degree, that really equips them to be able to transition into the program of choice, and that they're academically prepared to be successful once they transition. So you could see that year round, we have almost close to about 30,000 students who are earning some type of award or degree. Next slide. So as we're going through these slides, I will go ahead and give you the community college perspective, and then I'll hand it off to my colleague, Elieen, for her to give you the university perspective.
And we thought that would be a really nice thing. And here I just want to echo Rose and Steve and say thank you so much for having us here tonight. It is such a joy to be here, or this morning for you. It's really wonderful. And we really thought it would be helpful to hear both from the 2-year side and from the receiving institution, both sending and receiving, to give you kind of a balanced sense of both the many benefits, but also some of the challenges, and to really be honest and strategize about what's working, what doesn't work, what we're still trying to figure out, and some of the things that we admire about your efforts too. So as a receiving institution, UCLA, it's in the United States, it's the #1 public research institution in the country. So we love to say go Bruins. And we've got about 45,000 students, so not about half the size of Maricopa, but you'll see we have a lot of different institutions that send their students to us. But one of the things I think is really fascinating, and one of the many things I love about UCLA is that if you look at the first year students and then the number of transfer students, and this is actually mandated by our legislature. Our state has decided that in order to really make sure that public higher education in the United States really is open to everyone, whether they're from a privileged background or not, that really 2/3 of the institution should be set aside for first year students from a, those typical students whom you might think of, but that 1/3 would come only from community colleges. So it's part of a formula that UCLA has that's roughly 2-to-1. And I really love that. I love that by design, the institution is embracing a public mission, that it's not only to, sometimes I'm sad to say this, but sometimes higher education can sometimes seem to further reinforce inequality. And what I love to think in my heart is that here's an institution that's wonderful, but it's also with an open door and really trying to be receptive to transfer students, can actually not reinforce inequality, but be a counterbalance, can ameliorate, can make a difference, can help move the dial against inequality. And that's one of the many things I love about UCLA. You can see our main feeder colleges. And again, if you look at the degrees conferred, it's still roughly that 2-to-1 and by design. And so I think that's, if I can just kind of make one kind of overarching point there, and that is to really think of transfer students as part of your institution's enrollment as a strategic by design feature, that it shouldn't be just, oh, we didn't fill our first year class the way we wanted to and transfers or backfill, but instead, this is part of our institutional DNA. It's part of who we are, part of what higher education should be. And so I throw that out there as maybe a little bit of I don't want to say challenge, but just a little bit of an inspiration, because I really think that in my mind, this is why we're all here around this digital table, is to really think about how we make higher education work for the students of today. And on to the next slide, and to Rose.
So when we talk about establishing a memorandum of understanding, as indicated in my introduction, I have 25 years of higher education, 20 of them spent in transfer. And so I was pretty much thrown into the role of trying to figure out and establish the model for Maricopa and what works with our students. And so in the early stages, we basically designed this around principles. We knew that we wanted students to be supported as they go through one system to the other. We knew that we didn't want them to repeat competencies or knowledge and learning that they've already achieved, because that comes at a cost. It comes at a cost for time, and it comes at a cost of money, because we knew that students, when they went on to the university, they were retaking courses and they were having to repay money. And many of these students were getting federal financial aid. And so it was really important, not for Maricopa, but also for our state, to work towards a transfer model that supported students in their goals. And so here outlines some of the goals of our MOUs in terms of making sure that we're maximizing the learning that is achieved at the public colleges and universities. And then also, we are making arrangements and agreements in terms of how do we measure success. And I think that's very important. When you establish an MOU, it's one thing to say, we're going to partner together. And it's another thing to say, well, in order for us to make improvements and for us to design this to support student success, what does that look like to us? For Maricopa, it was, we collect data and we make sure that we examine the trends and the enrollment trends with our transfer students. But it was also very important for us to get student feedback related to their experience. So Maricopa is probably one in few institutions who actively surveys our students once they transfer to the university to gauge how their transfer experience was. Because that's where we get to the information and the opportunity to make improvements to the transfer process. So once our students transfer to one of these universities and they respond to the survey, they could tell us exactly the barriers or the pain points that they experienced throughout the process, and then we could actively address that. So it's more of a strategic by design plan to be able to use the data as well as surveys and student information to get that feedback. Now, we could only do that with and through MoUs. So the partners are committed as part of the partnership in order for them to formalize an agreement, an MoU with us. They agree to provide us with that data. They agree to provide us and to facilitate those surveys. And then they also agree to, as much as possible, maximize Maricopa's coursework as it applies to university degrees. And again, we are evolving our conversations because we know that transfer students are evolving and our learners are changing. And so what we're seeing is learners who are bringing with them learning that is outside of a traditional classroom. And that could be learners who are receiving employer certifications like IBM, Google, HubSpot, or they could be receiving training in their workforce. And so we're working with our university partners to say, you know, our learners and students are bringing this, and we want to recognize this. So we want to integrate this in our transfer conversations, because if we recognize this learning, they are ultimately going to go to your university. And so we want to work with you to make sure that those decisions are recognized and acknowledged, so that students don't have to repeat those competencies that we've recognized prior. Next slide. And for the student benefits, what we've outlined is that obviously they're maximizing their coursework and they're not having to repeat similar coursework at the university. So they're well on their way in achieving their educational goals. And they're also, working towards not losing credit. So how we define success is, how long does it take a student to earn that bachelor's degree, so the 4-year degree? Typically, it takes a transfer student 6 years, right? But through these partnerships and MOUs and the work that we are conducting with the universities, we are tightening that time frame where we're seeing students to be able to achieve that less than 6 years. In addition to that, we want to make sure that students are being recognized if they complete 2 years with us, that they are fully an upper division student once they go to the university. And in some cases, they're bringing with them more credits than 2 years. And we'll talk about that a little later in our session. As well as part of these partnerships, we've been able to negotiate transfer scholarships. So in working with our universities, it's become pretty competitive because having 55 university partners, they want to be the go-to institution. So they really want to provide flexibility. And then not only that, they want to provide the services and the financial aid and scholarships to be able to support, transfer students and to create an equal process and experience that they do with their first-year students.
So I just want to pick up on what Rose is saying here and reinforce the importance, if at all possible, to move away from course to course equivalencies, but this kind of block acceptance of the associate's degree. And that's actually, I think, incredibly key to a couple different things. One is just making sure that students actually get credit for what they've already learned, right? Just as Rosa said, we don't want you to redo it. You don't want to spend the money, you don't want to spend the time. We want you to actually get the credit for what you've done. But also it's just as Rose was touching on, it's this time to degree. And even though in the United States, we have Pell Grant funding for low income students that really allows them to have close to 5 years of undergraduate funding. Just as Rose is saying, the average length for a transfer student in the United States can be 6 years. So if we can do that block transfer and make sure they get that full credit for their first 2 years, then we can really make sure that that transfer process is smooth. Maybe they have an extra quarter if things weren't planned out entirely as well as they should be, but really students should be able to get out on time. And that's really key. So it's a big challenge. And a lot of it, as we discussed in the last webinar, it's faculty skepticism, right? They just don't want to think that, oh, UCLA, the #1 public, we couldn't possibly take that course for Maricopa. Well, actually, those teachers are dedicated to teaching instead of at UCLA, where they're perhaps more dedicated to research. And so those courses might actually, not that we like to admit it, might actually be of a higher quality, taught by someone who's really, really dedicated to teaching. And so there is that elitism with the faculty. So I think it's part of that. Another big mindset shift has to do with the four-year institution shifting their mindset, saying to themselves, I'm going to admit students sometimes based, and this is particularly school in a talent-based school like the School of Music, I'm going to admit students based not necessarily on privilege, right? Have they had years and years of private tutoring and all these advantages of a wealthier background? Or am I going to admit based on raw talent? Knowing that I'm a really good teacher, we're a really great university, and if you bring me the most talented students, we're going to give you the most talented graduates. And so it's a challenging mindset, but one that is just incredibly powerful. And I do think it comes down basically to that understanding the quality of courses, that it's there. That really understanding the expertise, the focus on teaching of those two-year colleges or junior colleges, as they're sometimes called in the United States, that the quality of teaching is just superlative. And so really not having that shift there. But along in that, talking about another mind shift, so we've got that block transfer, thinking about the faculty piece, thinking about the talent versus polish, thinking about the quality of courses. And then these last items that Rose has touched on, it's really imperative on the receiving institutions to think about their enrollment management strategy, and not just to have that target like UCLA does of 2/3 and 1/3, but more important, put your money where your mouth is. Make sure you have dedicated scholarships for transfer students. Make sure that you are not putting up barriers like application fees, and really thinking about, and I love this about what you're doing, really having a lot of care and attendance to the students' emotional, mental health as they make that transition, and thinking so intentionally and so beautifully as you do about how do we smooth that transition. I just think one of the most important things that you're doing that we can learn from is just this, from this gestational early period, already thinking about the students, their mental health, their acculturation, their transition, their happiness. And we all know that if you're happy, you're going to do good, and you do good and you're happy. It's just one of those conducive learning environment things. And so I just applaud you from the bottom of my heart, that right from the very start that you're already thinking about that. We haven't done that as well. Back to Rose.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, Elieen, in terms of this was a point of evolution for the Maricopa Community Colleges, because we knew that not only are we seeing and trying to create access for students no matter the origin of the credit. So this could be international students coming to Maricopa. It could be students from the workforce, military coming into Maricopa, really trying to work with the student where they're at in their, in their educational plan and process, but then integrating that with the universities and building trust. I always tell the universities that if you trust our faculty to make decisions related to transfer credit, then you could trust them to evaluate other types of learning, no matter the origin. And so we really evolved our conversations from focusing on the what, which is the learning itself, as opposed to the who taught it, because that's big in higher education in the United States. Everybody wants to know that the teacher who taught that course has the same credentials as I do. But that shouldn't be the focus. It should be what the student brings to them to the table. And so I appreciate Elieen reinforcing the faculty role related to these MOUs, because that's very important. They're the ones that drive the decisions. So they're the ones who really have to build that trust and that ability to understand that transfer articulation doesn't need to be exact. It doesn't need to be, exactly equivalent. It needs to be comparable. And so how we define comparable is, does it meet about 70% of the learning outcomes for that course? Now that takes a lot conversation to have faculty to basically, embrace that principle and that standard. But typically we've made progress related to that when they see that it doesn't have to be, apples and apples. It needs to be just comparable enough that the student can be successful in their next course and in their program. So advance to the next slide, please. So we're going to go through these, and it's going to be brief because we want to make sure that we leave room to have a conversation with you. But we wanted to highlight different types of agreements. So for the Maricopa Community Colleges, we transitioned to a general MOU, which is a good faith agreement. And the reason why we did that was because in the early days, we developed agreements based off of curriculum pathways, articulation, crosswalks, and tables. And what we found was curriculum is dynamic, is living, and it changes. And so anytime a program changed and a requirement changed, then all of a sudden we had to go back and update our MOU. And so we basically thought to ourselves, okay, let's work smarter and not harder. And so what we said was, we're going to develop a general MOU highlighting the expectations and the commitments for both institutions. So that's data exchange, it's services, it's advising, and it's also training and building awareness through marketing efforts. And what we indicate in our MOU is that anything that's created outside those products, the artifacts, the documentation, the crosswalks, will reside outside the MOU. So those could be updated all the time without impacting the spirit of the agreements. So next slide. This is back in the day, many, many years ago. This was the first arrangement. So this was the very iteration of the traditional 2+2 articulation agreement. So that was 2 years at the community college. Ideally, even though we know students don't really take 2 years for transfer students, it could be upwards to 3 to 4 years. But we made the arrangements and the pathways to be able to support 2-year completion, transfer to upper division as an upper division student. And these agreements would parallel the first direct entry students at the university. So we wanted to try to create equitable pathways to the university first-year student. And so it was outlining the most expeditious, efficient pathway possible. And it would be to support both full-time and part-time students. Many of our community college students are part-time, so it does take them a little longer to complete their credential. And not all of them do. And that's why I don't think it's in this presentation, but you might hear reverse transfer arrangement. And that's because we see a lot of students leaving the two-year institutions without a degree or credential. However, we've done a significant amount of preparation for these students to be successful. So as part of our partnerships, we've come to an agreement in our MOUs that we would exchange data to have the university send back course requirements to us, so that if a student fulfills the requirements of an associate degree, then we would award that. Next slide. So now this is newer, and it's not adapted by a lot of institutions, but it's growing and it's an emerging trend because of the cost of education. And because we understand that there are natural articulation breaks within a program. So say, for instance, to give you an example, an engineering degree would probably not fit this model. An engineering degree, because of the sequence, would probably encourage the student to complete as many requirements and prereqs at the community college, but transfer as soon as they're ready because of the sequencing of the program. But we do have programs like nursing and those technical programs, whether it's automotive technology or cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, that could accommodate more community college students. Now, this is growing in popularity with a lot of students because they're paying community college prices and they get to transfer more credits. So once they go to the university, they only have 30 credits at the university tuition cost. So you could see it's a very cost-effective pathway for students, but then again, it doesn't accommodate all programs. And that's where you need to work with your partners to determine which programs best suits this type of arrangement. And jump in anytime, Elieen, if you want to.
One piece I would add to what Rose had just said there is that just to reinforce what she said, it really depends on the program itself, whether it lends itself to a longer time at the two-year institution, or whether one should actually try to transfer earlier. To her point, nursing is great, maybe not engineering, and music, that would be music education, actually transfer earlier rather than later. So it really depends on the program, and that's where having good communication and a good relationship and a good partnership between the sending and the receiving institution is so important. The other thing I'd like to mention is that in addition to thinking about the transfer agreements, these MOUs, and Rose is going to get into this just now, I think in our early stages, we thought about this much more about the courses, about the credits. How are they going to transfer? Are we going to block transfer? Is it going to be by this course or that course? And actually what we've come to understand very slowly, so maybe you can get a jump on us now, learn from our mistakes, is that actually that's only a small part of it. What's much more important is actually understanding what fosters student mobility and successful graduation. How do they get that credential that's going to enhance their life? It's going to give them a better job, a family sustaining wage, to use Steve's words here. And really having an equity lens about, I'm really going to try to make this an equitable pathway for all students. And then, the arrangements actually start to become much more focused, not just on the courses, but just what Rose is going to talk about now, the data sharing that's essential to make sure that the student outcomes are equitable for traditional students versus these kind of neo-traditional students, this kind of new normal. And also understanding that it's a little bit more about the financial arrangements, about what the promises are of the receiving institution. We're not going to just take your coursework. We're not just going to accept you as a student. We're going to give you funding opportunities. We're going to think about your mental health and how we're going to have a receptive ecosystem that's going to foster your success. And we're going to use data to do that. We're going to understand what's working, what's not. And, not critical, but just actually analytical about how do we do what we're doing better with a lens towards equity and a lens on very much focused on student success. So back to Rose here.
So I'm going to do a
do-
little time check, folks. We've got
Okay.
about 15 minutes left, so we need to, we want to make sure we have time for our questions from the audience.
Okay, so this just to highlight, it's the data sharing agreement, which in our system, and I think in most of higher education in the United States, is a formal, it does go through legal because it has student information and there are federal protection, for students related to information that we could share. So that just gives you a little bit more definition of what these data sharing agreements are. So we could advance to the next slide. Guaranteed admission is just another type of an agreement where the receiving institution agrees to guaranteed admission for the students if they complete a credential and a GPA to enter into that institution. These are typically selective in nature, so it's selective admissions. We see this related to pre-med programs, pharmacy, and so forth, where the receiving institution sets the admission criteria, and if the student meets it, they're guaranteed admission. And then the next slide. Concurrent enrollment. This is a growing, emerging trend, and that's where a student can attend a community college and a university at the same time. What I like about this arrangement is the student gets to get into their content. What we say is for community college students, sometimes they don't get excited about general education, right? They want to get into the meat of their program, whether it's cybersecurity or forensic psychology or engineering. They want the content along with the general education that we provide. So this is a way for institutions to be able to really work with the student and provide resources from both partners, the community colleges through their advising and supporting the student to the receiving, and both institutions are contributing to the educational pathway to the student simultaneously. And then the next. So some of the criteria that we've established and we're evolving as we're growing with our transfer model is we need some sort of oversight. So the institution has to have some sort of oversight, and they agree to, as much as possible, accept as much credits as possible, and then also working towards that block transfer. And then not only that, providing the meaningful incentives to students. So outside of that, really focused on the students and how we could really support them with the wraparound services that will help them be successful in their transition. So next. Thank you. And then for our international, the same thing. It's attached to some sort of a government oversight, just a comparable system to what we have domestically. And then we utilize the same principles as much as possible to really work with the institutions and trying to align best as possible the curriculum so that we could support that intake of international credit to onboard students onto a Maricopa credential and degree, and then working with our universities, making sure that they recognize that as part of the Maricopa experience. And then next. And then we'll just go through, I won't read through this. I shared this with you in the last webinar, but we organize our services around our MoU. So depending on the enrollments, we organize our way around service levels to be able to manage our resources and the expectations of the receiving institutions. So the standard level, you could see what we offer our partner institutions as implementation of the MoU. For the next slide, it's the signature level. So in addition to that tier of services, we offer even more services if you meet a certain threshold of enrollment. Then we really get into deeper conversations, deeper relationships to support transfer students, because we know that based off enrollments, more students go to this level of partners. And so we want to make sure that we're providing them with adequate support as part of the MoU. And then the final, which would be the next slide, would be the premium. And that's what we dedicate to our 3 public universities. They get the majority of our students, so they get all 3 levels. And again, I encourage you to, as you're talking about entering into agreement, is really figuring out how to structure it so that you can set the expectation to the receiving institution, what you could provide them, depending on your resources. But this is also a way for you to also, monitor it based off enrollment to support the majority of your transfer students. And then next slide. And there you go.
There we go. Well, perfect. Well, just chock-a-block full of wonderful information. My thanks to you both. I want to take perhaps just 3 or 4 minutes, because we also want to have time for questions from the audience. But I've got some pretty mechanical questions to ask you both in terms of how one goes about doing an MoU. So who facilitates an MoU? Can it come from the 2-year institution, or should it come from the 4-year institution? Is there a right way of doing that? Who should reach out first?
I'll go ahead and
I'll
go
dive
ahead.
in. Rose can because it's interesting, right? The 2 different perspectives. So I would say actually it's either that can reach out, but it always has to be supported by data, right? So that, and both institutions are doing that, right? The 2-year institutions are looking at where are most of our students going, because we have limited time, money, and energy. So I want to make sure that if we're having more substantive partnerships, and I love that Maricopa under Rose's leadership has these different levels. How do I want to make sure that my efforts have the most impact for the most students, and the same for the receiving institutions. Where are we getting most of our students? Because those are the relationships. I don't want to be friends with everyone. I want to have a couple of really close friends that I really partner with, and that actually we develop enough trust so that we can kind of say, like, well, this part of our here is working, this part isn't, and that, as my grandmother would say, we can casually tell each other that our slip is showing, that it's okay to kind of say, oh, well, we should fix this over here. And there's a certain a beauty to just having a real clear-eyed focus on the success of our shared students. So I'd say it can come from either, Steve, but really has to be supported by the data, because you can't be friends with everyone.
Rose, what do you say?
I agree. It could come from anywhere. We've had faculty members who reach out to their alumni and basically say, I want my students to go to an historically Black college and university. Or it could come from a discipline who said, I can't find a university within a state that has my discipline, so I'm going to go search for a university that will take my students. At Maricopa, transfer and articulation is centralized. We have 10 colleges underneath our district office, so it does go through a central process to develop, and our provost signs off on it. But the origination of these conversations could begin anywhere. Sometimes we see that it starts at a concert. Somebody sitting next to, a faculty member who works at a university down the street, and they want to enter into an articulation agreement or a conference. And so I think as long as you have an established process where people know who to contact, and that there's a formal process that is objective, so that you can apply, decisions, equally, then I think that would be my best pearls of wisdom.
So that's actually my next question, though. What does that look like? Can anybody just do an agreement with anybody any old time? Or, you know, if Elieen reached out to you, Rose, and said, hey, let's just do a memorandum of understanding, would your chancellor be okay with that? Or is there a process? And what does that process look like?
We do have an application process. So we do have a criteria. So through the online application, they have to meet a certain criteria in order for them to move through the next phase. And then they have to have a conversation with us. But it is determined by the centralized office and the provost. As much as possible, we try to support the college's requests, but not all requests are approved because it could service one program and not the district. And so we utilize a series of process steps and through the application process to determine, you know, is it worthwhile to pursue? Do they have the enrollment? Are they committed to providing meaningful incentives? Are they maximizing credit? So all the things that we discussed prior is part of our application process.
And I would just add to that, Steve, that it's both a top down and a bottom up, right? There's nothing better than the faculty to faculty connection. Just like Rose said, maybe they're just sitting next to each other at a sporting event or a concert or something like that. But I will also say that there is just, it really does help when you have a transfer champion, whether that's your dean, a chancellor, a president, a provost, whatever their role and authority is, that they bring that gravitas to the table and that they reach out to their counterpart, you know, both sending and receiving institution as an equal. And really, I treasure the partnerships that we have at UCLA, that I know everyone's phone. We all call each other. I talk about an issue, a student, a possibility, a grant, a wonderful opportunity, everything. So it's really important for these partnerships, not just to live on paper, but to come to life with the
That was
faculty.
actually going to be my next question. So what does that look like after you sign that agreement? Is it just a piece of paper? What do you need to do after that?
Yeah, well, I think there's speaking from the receiving institution, it's a lot of education. So before we have our enrollment season every year, we have a mandatory dean's breakfast, because I think it's really important to remind everyone of student equity and why we exist as a publicly funded institution, that our mission, and it's not telling people what to do. That doesn't work well with faculty. I'm sure it's not any different any place else in the world. But to really appeal to someone's greater good, to their heart, to a noble calling, if you will, and to remind folks of that just before we actually start the audition season. And I think that's an important part that the leaders play, that they set the tone, they set the expectation for how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to welcome each other to the table.
Rose, what would you say?
I would say I would divide it into the 3 stages. For us, it's a negotiation process because we're going to negotiate the best possible opportunity for our students. I think many of us can agree that we don't want to have the most partners because we know that, you know, the paradox of choice, too many options, too many choices lead to bad decisions. We want to have the most meaningful, deep agreements that are truly going to support students. And so we basically established a process that held the universities accountable. So they basically committed to these in the MoU, they committed to these obligations, and we measure those commitments every year. And we monitor enrollment, participation, and then also you know, having those conversations. If they're not committed to this and we have evidence of it, then we would have a conversation about discontinuing it, because we don't want to set up students to go to a university or institution that is not supported or truly committed. So it's not going to reside in a file. It's not going to basically just, you know, be about the showmanship of it through the signing ceremony. It truly has to be a living document that is supported by both institutions. So there's a negotiation, implementation, and a maintenance phase, because again, these agreements have to be maintained, which means you have to monitor the participation progress and the documentation and articulation products developed under these agreements.
That's wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, you can hear my excitement. I've worked with these professionals, these leaders for many years, and I learn something new every time I do talk with them. Listen, we don't have a whole lot of time left, Kin, but I want to make sure that our colleagues out there in Hong Kong and beyond have a chance to ask some questions as well. So I'm going to throw it right back to you.
Wonderful, wonderful. So there's a William Huang. Thank you for sharing. It was mentioned that MoU support transfer. Oh, cannot see it.
I think
Okay,
you said the general education core. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah. May have a lot of opinion. Does the MoU cover those discipline-specific course, or there should be another MoU signed on the departmental level?
Okay.
What a great question.
Yeah, and I'm excited that they asked this question because we have a unique framework and approach that we handle this. In Arizona, with the 3 public universities and the community college districts in Arizona within the state, we have statewide agreements that are committed not only to the associate degrees, but to the general education core. So the 3 public universities have agreed to accept that as a block. And we do publish the courses that are part of that core. But what is even more unique is the Maricopa Community Colleges, because 75% of our students go to Arizona State University. We actually submit our general education course proposals to Arizona State University. So ASU basically approves our general education because there's so much swirling that goes on between the institutions that they have a say in what is deemed general education, and those courses are part of our general education course matrix. So there's a unique relationship with our biggest feeder partner because we want to make sure and ensure that transferability, that we do engage in that process. So that is giving up a little of our kind of academic freedom, but again, it's in support of student transfer and success.
And so, William, I would say just a slightly different from UCLA, and that is yes, you're exactly right. That there is the general education courses, and the 2-year EGETSI is kind of a fancy name for that kind of block transfer. But for specialized courses, whether for us, it might be music theory, for education, it might, for music education, it might be something else, for engineering, something different entirely. That you're exactly right. Faculties have a lot of opinions on it. I love that tactful phrase. And that's where the challenges lie. You've put your pulse right on, your finger right on the pulse of the difficulty and the challenge. And if I have found that if you go to some of the most difficult friction points and start to build trust from even just a shared course or 2 there and build out, that's a really successful way to eventually get to that block transfer. I think it's a good point of entry. You kind of have to do it to build the trust. But if you can get away from that and move to the block transfer as soon as possible, that's really the most efficient way. And it's also the best way to really foster student success, because you don't want to bring them in. And again, just what Rose was saying, having them repeat a course they've already taken someplace else.
Yeah. And William and Elieen, I wanted to add to that because I just saw that second half of that question is, yes, the greatest challenges were with the discipline specific, the content specific courses. However, we have a statewide course equivalency guide that is published and it's public. So faculty can go in there and students can see how these courses, the community college courses, transfer to the university. And once they start to see the progress that's made in other disciplines, it kind of provides them with that reassurance that it's okay to have these conversations. And as we shared in our last webinars, our faculty meet every year in the fall with their university counterparts to have these conversations, whether it's general education or around discipline-specific courses. They're constantly working on negotiating articulation and the articulation of courses and programs.
Thank you. Okay, so see whether there's a, so audience, please feel free to just like William to post your whatever questions. I have another question myself actually. So I just want to update or give some information, I mean, about Hong Kong situation, because I heard from your sharings that like the average is 6 years to complete a 4-year program. But in Hong Kong, actually we kind of have a system to limit this possibility. Yeah, so I think in some ways good, okay, because we have a kind of a 2+2, this system. We're talking about vertical transfer. So if for some students from community college, if they cannot get into this vertical transfer, so they usually go to study year 1. So they will have a 4-year then. Yeah, so it usually will not go to 6 years like that. Yeah, so we are more structured in this sense. But of course, this structure, it might not be good in some way because the 2+2 actually is not really aligned very well. So the student get into the university have a heavy study load then, because their prior learning not very well recognized. So they have to, within the 2 years, have to finish all those subjects then. So that's why mental health is an issue. Yeah. Anyway, so I think ours a bit different in this sense. Yeah. So so we have a 2+2 and we have a quota system like that. So there's certain number of students. So like Rose, you're sharing is that like if the student meets certain GPA or certain subjects, so there's a guarantee admission. So this probably might be difficult because like there's some department, they only have a quota of like 5 students, for example, or some have a 10, some have, like for us nursing, we have 40. Yeah, so different universities have different, like the other university maybe for nursing have 60 like that, or some with 20. Right? So different universities have different quota. Yeah, when they submit to the government for admit those students. Yeah. So yeah. So based on our Hong Kong context, what do you think? And also for the agreement, because we have been at least 10 years already, this arrangement of the student from community college to the university, but we just don't have a formal system. So so we, in some way, we already admit students from just like Elieen has mentioned that it's data driven. We should look at the data to see where those students come from, and then work with the partner institution to see how those agreements. But we have a kind of an informal agreement. We are not really signing an agreement, but we do have agreement. We have a trust. We have, I guess, okay, for example, for me with the partner department. So we can't agree on a certain subject. So we don't really sign it, but we commit with those agreements. Yeah. So yeah.
I think based off of our experience, we started with general pathways because it was protecting a lot of undecided students within our state. But we know that students need prescription, right? They need to know exactly the courses to take and what apply to their program. So we see a lot of students who, or we did see a lot of students who were shut out of programs because of the selection process or the limited capacity. So we really try to inform students in advance that that could be a possibility and that we would work with them as much as possible to identify contingency plans. So where else can they go to maybe, enter that program if it's not one of our state universities? We've done a pretty good job at creating access by creating applicable programs. So maybe not selective programs, but it's a variation of that that students can go into. But it is an ongoing problem in terms of helping students plan. If one option does not work out, how can they be prepared to identify other options so that they're not interrupted in their pathway?
And I would say the additional question, Ken, to your point about time to degree, most of our students in community colleges attend college part-time. So a lot of that extended time is because, well, they're working or they're taking care of families or they're doing other things. And community colleges, at least in America, are quite adaptable and encouraging of that kind of approach. But that's sometimes why students take so much longer. It's not because they take necessarily, I think many of them, if they could go full-time, if there was financial support to do that, I think they would complete in 4, but many, because of other responsibilities, take longer. And from our perspective, as long as they get that degree or that certificate that they're working towards, that's a good thing.
Yeah. So, and also this is something also might be a bit different from US, is that our transfer student, they more or less the student, like they just graduate from the high school.
Mhm.
So because of the public exam, didn't do that well to get into university. So they get into the community college. So their age is more or less the same actually. So they are full-time. Our program are full-time. We don't have part-time for that. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay, so Peter, I also have a question. So let's see. Oh, there's a few questions.
Well, there was a
actually.
question
Let me see.
before regarding online
Yeah,
courses,
yeah,
and
please,
that's
yeah.
increasingly an issue. Obviously, as we move out of the pandemic, many more of our students are taking online courses, and they're going to have a ton of online course credit. Now, when I was at the University of California previously, and I'm not speaking for them now, that was some years ago, I don't know that our policy really addressed the sort of ongoing increase of students taking those kinds of courses from Coursera and edX. But I do believe, and I think your faculty should consider, that you're going to see students with a great deal more of that credit and come up with arrangements that work for you and arrangements that work for students so that they may be able to use that credit in some fashion.
Thank you.
And there I would just reiterate what Stephen has just shared, but also to say that there are a lot of exams that one can take to demonstrate your competency in those areas. They're standardized. So for example, we have CLEP exams that you can take, these national exams that regardless of where you learned the knowledge, whether it was workplace-based learning or Coursera or edX, you could go ahead and take that CLEP exam to demonstrate your competency in that area, and in a sense, be passed out of that course. But I defer really to Rose, because a lot of students, frankly, are very entrepreneurial, and if
Yes.
the receiving four-year institution is too snobby, actually they're very savvy consumers. They go
I
to the
agree.
two-year institution that's more that is more progressive, and figure out a way to get credit for the learning that is due to them. And then they transfer it to the four-year institution. So they're very savvy consumers. So I would actually encourage the 4 years to be a little more liberal, because they're going to get the credit anyway.
Yeah, as long as they could verify that there has been proficiency or mastery, right? And so we're really trying to create solutions here and not barriers. And they are pretty savvy. And so what you're going to find is a new parallel higher educational system that is going to be made up of alternate educational providers like Coursera, edX. But not only that, industry providers like Google and IBM, who are providing their own industry recognized certifications. And so these students need to go somewhere. So what they're going to do is they're going to find other opportunities. And that's why it's an incentive for institutions to work together to be that first option for students, so that they don't have to go searching to better not only themselves, but the lives of their families and their communities. We really want to make this easier for them and not harder.
Ken, I know we're well
Yes, thank
over our
you.
time, but I
Yeah,
did
but
want to
that's fine.
respond to Peter. I did want to
Yes,
respond to
please.
Peter because that's completely related to that question as well, talking about the use and the use of international credits or the ways in which students can travel internationally. Honestly, again, as we move out of this pandemic, we're going to have a lot of very savvy students who are using courses and programs around the world in order to get the credit they need. As Rose just said, it may be industry sponsored, it may be academic and traditional, but they're going to be bringing that. So all of us who are involved in this kind of credit transfer world have a new beginning before us, because again, I don't know, for instance, in California, where we have dealt with that especially well, but will need to, as Elieen points out in her response in the chat.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, I know the time, but I have actually a few more questions, but I think because of the time, if the audience have any question, you can either send to us or I think Stephen in your first webinar mentioned that they can contact you as well, right?
Of course.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So for me, I think I will contact three of you again to have a certain question. Like for example, I think Rose mentioned about the nursing program. Like in Hong Kong, actually, nursing program also regulated by the council, the nursing council. So there must be some kind of a requirement from the council as well. So how to also meet their needs requirement is another issue. Yeah, but anyway, so I will contact you again. So for the audience, if you have any question, you please feel free to contact them, or through us, we can pass the question to the speakers, because they are really have a lot of experience on this topic. And also when we really work on the agreement, maybe we have certain challenges. We can also consult them as well then. Yeah, so thank you so much, three of you, our honorable, very experienced speakers. So I have some after presentation work to inform the audience. Yeah, so student, no, not student, I mean the audience, please, as a teacher all the time. So thanks to Elieen and also Steve. So they also present their email, okay, in the chat box. Yeah. So our next local section will be on June 3rd, 1 to 2 p.m. So we invite some speaker from the local setting. So please register if you have time. And also we value your feedback as well. Just like what the speaker mentioned, that like evaluation is very important. We will improve from time to time for arranging the webinar or future events. Yeah, and also we will send you a certificate as well to acknowledge your participation. Yeah, so I will end the webinar here. Thank you for the three speakers again. Very insightful, and hope you have a nice evening.
Thank you very much. Great fun,
Yeah.
as always.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
I
you.
learned a lot.
Good day.
All right. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Thank you.